Hello, everybody. It's great to be back. And today my guest is none other than the one and only Clive Wynne. Clive will be known to many of you because of his recent book, Dog is Love. And for those of you watching the video, you can see a copy of it here. And I've known Clive for a little while. He's been to visit us in Lincoln a few times. I've yet to come and visit him, but I hope when COVID is over, that will happen soon enough. And believe it or not, we should have been in the same room doing this recording. If COVID hadn't struck, he would have been on sabbatical and probably staying with me in Lincoln. But it is what it is. He's here. I'm really pleased he's here. He really doesn't need much introduction. If you know his book, you'll know him as somebody who believes fervently in the emotional side of the dog-human relationship and how important it is. And it's an area that I'm particularly interested in with my own research. And Clive, when I read the book, and Clive told me about the book a while ago, it was quite a surprise because Clive is known as a hardcore behaviorist. We'll explain what we mean by that, but certainly he was. I'm not sure that he is anymore. He may have been kicked out of every behaviorist association. He's written a number of books on animal cognition in various forms, and he's also written the somewhat provocatively titled book "Do Animals Think?" as well, and I'm sure we're going to cover all those sorts of things. He is a first-class scientist, and for somebody with that pedigree to move into the what some people might call the more touchy-feely, more abstract field is not easy. I'm a vet. I've always been chatting about these sorts of things. I didn't have the scientific reputation that Clive did before he started to move here. And I don't think it's damaged your reputation. I honestly don't. But it's lovely to see you, Clive.
Well, it's great to be with you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me to do this. As you say, the plan was that we were going to be co-located and we could be down the pub having this conversation, but well,
yeah, but at least we don't get the clanker and the jukebox in the background here. Wow. But you're looking good. You're looking well.
I think I'm holding up.
I think we're both going a bit stir crazy though as a result of this lockdown. As I said, it's lovely to just chat to you. It's always a lot of fun. So I mentioned in the beginning, you've sort of been on this journey, which you document really nicely in the book. And I guess, I'll start by reading something that I picked up from a review of Do Animals Think? And you probably can remember this. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. The book's, 17 years old? Clive Wynne debunks some commonly held notions about our furry friends. It may be romantic to ascribe human qualities to critters, he argues, but it's not very realistic. While animals are by no means dumb, they don't think the same way we do. I love that bit, actually. Contrary to what many popular television shows would have us believe, animals neither have theory of mind capabilities that humans have, that is, they are not conscious of what others are thinking, nor the capacity for higher level reasoning. So in Wynne's view, when Fido greets your arrival by nudging your leg, he's more apt to be asking for dinner than commiserating with your job stress. Now, I don't think that's incompatible, actually, with Dog is Love. The science of why and how your dog loves you. And I just thought that was a really interesting sort of contrast, because I think it's really easy for people to confuse cognition with emotion. When they're working in this field and whatever. And there's been lots of groups, and I've chatted on these podcasts with lots of people about animal cognition. And I've said on several occasions, I don't think dogs are terribly smart, but they're incredibly observant. And, that emotional empathy that they have, or attunement that they have, is a really great skill that is adaptive. Right. But that's sort of my take on it. And I just wonder, how do you think how has your view changed, or has your view changed from Do Animals Think to Dog is Love?
Yeah, no, well, that's a really interesting angle to pick up, Daniel, because I mean, Do Animals Think was written when I was still in Australia. So that's 20 years ago. And I haven't really gone back to concern myself greatly with the question how my thinking might have changed. I certainly stand by deep skepticism about anthropomorphism. I think that this natural, unavoidable tendency to project human qualities onto animals does animals an immense disservice. It's a misunderstanding, and in some sense, it's a failure of imagination. I mean, we have to try and see the world from the animal's point of view. So I'm still strong against anthropomorphism. So far as dogs are concerned, and other species in general, I think there is a natural tendency to get overexcited about potential signs of advanced cognition, theory of mind, which is to say an understanding that other individuals have minds of their own with their own knowledge and intentions and so forth. Where I think I do see a change in my point of view is that 20 years ago, I was also prone to minimize the importance of emotion in animal lives. And now my thinking has evolved to recognize that, particularly when it comes to dogs, that it's actually pretty much all about emotion, that dogs are highly emotional beings. And that, as the title of the book says, dog is love. The crux of the dog-human relationship is the emotional connection, the bond. And I think that's something, well, certainly that quote from the review where I apparently said 20 years ago, or the reviewer interpreted me as saying 20 years ago, that when your dog is excited because you come home, the dog is just thinking of food. I would no longer, if I ever held that view, and I honestly don't remember, I would no longer argue that. I think when you come home, your dog is authentically pleased to see you. Now, the fact that you also feed the dog comes into that, but it's not the essence of it. Yeah.
So, first of all, I've obviously got a later version of your book because I've got it as 2004, which is like, but if you say it's 20 years, that's 20 years, that's fine.
Well, I could
maybe I've got
know,
reprint.
My memory is not. Is it really 2004?
When did you move from Australia to?
2002. I could have sworn I was writing that in Australia.
Maybe you wrote it in Australia and it came out late. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. But no, I think it's fascinating because I mean, the other thing is, as this is, I don't know, give me the right term, but as a hardcore behaviorist, you worked a lot on learning theory in very controlled laboratory environments where reinforcement is everything. And I'm going to just profess my ignorance here, because, as I said, I'm a vet by first degree, so it's a slightly alien environment. But if you've been drilled in experimental psychology like that, and you're doing learning, how can you talk about reinforcement without talking about emotion?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, I view myself as post-behaviorist and post-ethologist, and trying to draw, as I say, I think in the introduction to my textbook, Animal Cognition, I think it's there that I've written this, that developing an appreciation of different schools of science is deeply dissimilar from choosing a sports team, right? If you're an Arsenal supporter,
I am indeed, unfortunately, at the moment.
Oh, really? Well, maybe that's why it sprung into my head. I don't know. Maybe I knew that already.
Yeah.
An Arsenal supporter has to support Arsenal whether they win or lose, right? I mean, they're your team. You can't just change sides because they're not doing very well. Supporting football teams, supporting sports teams is all about loyalty and
religion.
And you have to. Sorry?
It's religion.
Oh, it's like religion. Exactly. I steer away from religion as an example because I don't want to cause offense. Whereas, well, I guess people get offended by talk about their favorite sports teams as well. But so I think, and I mean, you see this in our graduate students, right? I mean, a lot of young people, as they're being apprenticed into a field of science, they feel uncertain where they fit in, and they feel a drive to grab onto a team, a church, and hold on to it. This is mine. I'm one of these now. And I go to their conference and I'm with them, right? And I tell my students, and I've written this in my textbook, this is absolutely not the right attitude to take. If you're developing an interest in a scientific domain and a set of scientific problems, the correct attitude, in my view, is to inform yourself about all of the component sports teams, churches, religions that claim to contribute to this field, and to then take the best from each of them and to happily discard other components. And, you know, old school behaviorism, Skinnerian behavior analysis, Skinner died in 1990. There's really no excuse for being a slavish follower of Skinner today. And likewise, on the other major team in animal behavior science, the other major team was the ethologists. And Lorenz died in 1989, and Tinbergen died a little before that, I think. So all these people are long gone. We don't have to be worried about upsetting Skinner by taking some aspect of what he said and approving and using it and ignoring the rest. So I feel no embarrassment about saying, yeah, you know, I'm a behaviorist. I value tight experimental control. I see the role of reinforcement and punishment as an essential tool, which appears to be present in every animal that has ever been tested for. In itself, it's a very simple mechanism, but through the vagaries and complexities of life, it can lead to wonderfully complex performances. And yet at the same time, I inform myself about species-specific behavior. I think the ethogram, I don't know how anybody does work without an ethogram. And it's interesting that the behavior analysts actually reinvented the ethogram. I forget now what they call it, but they actually have the same product by a different name. So
they have lots of things by a different name, like
well, right. And in terms
functions.
of my training, my PhD, I did not find I did not find a particularly useful education. I feel that my real education came during my postdocs, and I postdoced with two guys. They're friends of each other, but they came from completely different disciplines. So I postdoced with John Stadden, who was a student of Skinner's at Harvard. And I postdoced with Juan Delius, who was a student of Tinbergen's at Oxford. And so those 6 years as a postdoc were my real education in this field.
That's a fantastic opportunity to have.
Yeah.
I mean, I love hearing you say this, because I mean, you know, I work in the field of dealing with problem behavior in animals, and it became apparent to me a long time ago. In fact, in a conference in 1997, I said, there are problems with the way that we describe problem behavior. And as far as I can see, there are two schools. There is the behaviorist school, or the dog trainers, the Barbara Woodhouses, and you know, and the like. And to them, it's all about environment. And you don't make a diagnosis, you just reshape the environment and you move on and things like that. And then there's the rise of the veterinary behavioral field, where everything is being medicalized.
Yeah.
And there's also, you know, and it's increasingly recognized, and it was being recognized then, about some of the issues with psychiatry and the medicalization of normal behavior. You know, in the first version of DSM, homosexuality was considered a mental disorder. You know, right. You know, they were social constructs, and they really, and I was arguing then that we need to find a middle ground. And what I developed, what I call the psychobiological approach, is, and it's not that it's an alternative, it's a synthesis. It takes the best, you know, the way we make inferences about motivational state, which the behaviorist, applied behaviorist, or applied behavioral analyst perhaps doesn't want to talk about, is I actually do a functional analysis of behavior and then think, what's the best intervening variable to explain everything that's going on?
Yeah,
that gives me the motivation. Yeah. And then, you know, I've taken component process theory from people like Shearer and said, right, okay, in order to understand the emotional side, and emotion is not the same as motivation. I can't believe, you know, I still quite recently have been to conferences where people talk about emotivation as if they're the same. Mm-hmm. And, you know, mm-hmm. and I was at a conference a few years ago. There's still no consensus on what emotion is. So it's not surprising that people are in a bit of a mess. But for me, emotion is actually about the judgment of the personal significance of something. That's why we have emotions. Otherwise, you know, everything would be the same. It's it's what results in individual differences. And because I work with problem behavior, that's what my science is about. It's about dealing with the individual. So yes, it could be motivated, but why is this individual motivated in that situation and not that? And that's because of the emotional processes. And the emotions set the strategies, and the motivation determines the exact behavior. So I'm scared, I want to escape.
Right.
How I escape, I can talk about the motivation to run, I can talk about the motivation to fight, I can talk about the motivation to freeze.
Yeah.
And it's just that sort of, and I love this sort of, yeah, like you, I just love this idea that it's not, you don't have to be in one camp or the other. It's about taking the best of everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, looking at your background, yeah, your first degree is in human sciences, which is perhaps the University College London word for psychology. I don't know why you use two words.
Wow. I mean,
was it anthropology? I don't know.
It was. So it was invented by the anatomist J.Z. Young, who wrote a book, An Introduction to the Study of Man. And
animal vertebrates or something. I've got a copy of J.Z.
Yeah. He wrote. I think he wrote the book Vertebrates, something like that.
Yeah.
He was retired by the time I got there, but he still was wheeled out on Friday mornings to give us these lectures where he told the most amazing first-person stories about, I heard about this chap in Canada who said he found a neuron that reacted to a hand. So I flew over to Canada and had a look, and here's what I found. He was great like that. But that, I mean, now that I've been based in the United States for a long time, in the US, it's quite standard for undergraduate degrees to have considerable diversity. Whereas, as you know, in the UK, undergraduate degrees tend to railroad students into their specialty very quickly. And really, human sciences, from an American perspective, is just a perfectly normal undergraduate degree. It just was an open-ended undergraduate degree where I was allowed to take any class so long as I could argue that it contributed to a scientific understanding of the human condition. So I could take anything in biology, anything in psychology, anything in anthropology. I even tried to take a class in genetics, but it was too difficult for me. So
and that was 1983.
Yeah, well, it was hard enough then. My goodness.
Mind you, teaching was pretty crap then.
I don't know. I still remember. It's funny thinking about it, as I still remember some of my teachers from my undergraduate years very, very vividly. Yeah.
No, we had a great diversity, but there's been a big press. I shouldn't be so flippant, but universities have really taken teaching seriously in the last 10 years. And the government evaluates us on our teaching skills as much as, well, almost as much as they do on our research as well.
Right.
It isn't UCL that also has you talk about J.Z. Young being wheeled out. Isn't UCL that has Jeremy Bentham? Is it?
Oh yeah.
So he gets wheeled out literally.
He gets quite literally
this story. So
that's right.
Did you ever get to see the real Jeremy Bentham?
Oh yeah. He was in a cabinet in.
So just explain, in case people don't know who Jeremy Bentham is. Jeremy Bentham is sort of widely considered one of the fathers of ethics and utilitarianism. So you act for the greater good. And when he died, he asked that he be stuffed and put in this glass cabinet. And UCL kept him and still brought him out for committee meetings. And I don't know whether they still do, but anyway.
Well, I don't think in my lifetime, or probably your lifetime, they wheeled him out for committee meetings, but he was in a cabinet in a large sort of central lobby area where you could go and look at him. He just looked like a waxwork, but apparently it was a waxwork built on his own brain, on his own bones, not his own brains. And I think the brain was in a separate box or something. So yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, for me, a little kid from the provinces, it was unbelievably stimulating and exciting. And I caught the bug. I can remember coming back after a winter break and being so thrilled to be back in the library and taking notes, because that's what you did in those days, because there were no photocopiers or you couldn't download a PDF. So you actually had to write handwritten notes. And I can remember a fellow student at the long bench table thing where we were all working, asking me if I could please write a bit quieter, because I was just so thrilled to be there that I was making quite a racket with my writing. I still feel that. So it was wonderful. I mean, there were great people. Yeah, I mean, anthropology, just even a little bit of anthropology, I think, does people a great deal of good, especially in our field, to sort of circle back around a little bit. I mean, if you're interested in pet animals and dogs in particular, one of the things that makes dogs so rich, and pets in general, I guess, so rich, is that on the one hand, they exist as biological objects, they're living organisms, but at the same time, they're also human social constructs. So that the way it is to be a dog and what it means to be a dog and how a dog lives and how long it lives and what it eats and what it does depends on the human social context in which that dog is placed. So different people view the same being in quite different ways, and that's
absolutely,
that's
again, with problem behavior, that I see that the whole time,
right
within a family, that for one person, this dog doesn't have any problem. And again, this is something I teach the students. The concept of problem behavior is a social construct,
right
an emergent phenomenon, whichever way you want to spin it.
Right.
You cannot measure it entirely objectively because it is somebody's construction of the dog's behavior,
right
cat's behavior, anything like that, and you have to understand that. So you've got the husband who says, no, there's nothing wrong with the dog, I can control him whatever way he does.
Yeah.
And the wife saying, the dog is biting me 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Problem. And you've got to navigate that course. And I think it's a shame. I hadn't thought about it, but as you said, the British undergraduate system does streamline, like we do A levels. We do 3 A levels, as opposed to doing an international baccalaureate where you do 7 or 8 courses.
Right.
And, I think the argument has always been, well, we streamline people and therefore they become, they get further along the line sooner. But you do wonder at what cost to their actual education and ability to think in different ways and see other perspectives that comes.
It depends on the individual. I mean, it saves a lot of money because you get through the undergraduate degree in 3 years instead of 4. Even in Scotland, they're spending 4 years doing undergraduate degrees. It saves a lot of money. And for people who know where they're going, it's fantastic. But I was rather lost as I ended high school and really wasn't sure. And so it suited me very well to be given.
Well, I was the same. And even though I went on to be a vet, I didn't know what I want to do. I just thought, I'll be a vet. My dad's a vet. And although he's not very happy at being a vet, I think I could enjoy being a vet. And it gives me 5 years to think what I want to do, and it's a good science training. And and I loved being in practice. I really loved being in practice. Not to my surprise, I don't really have any plans, and I just sort of drifted into academia. There's so many people get disaffected, but I just love the sort of thinking about things, and from my point of view, the success that I've had often is because I work with lots of specialists, but because I'm a vet, I did a little bit of biochemistry. I did some genetics. I had to know these subjects. So I'm the hub and I pull together these folks, and they kindly keep me in their team. Well, I can speak to all of them in some form or other.
I think that's what we need. I think to do what we do, to study animal behavior, pet animal behavioral problems, you need to be able to draw on a diverse set of principles and skills. Going back to what I was saying, even within, if you just consider yourself somebody studying animal behavior, there are multiple claims of ownership of that discipline, from the behavior analysts to the ethologists to the clinical medical sort of veterinary approach. And this is very interesting when you ask people, so what is a happy dog? What is positive welfare for an animal? And classically, a veterinarian is the person one would turn to, and the veterinarian would count how many teeth the animal has and how fat or thin it is and check for disease. And the veterinarian has a definition of welfare. Then you go to your friends in zoology and you ask them the same question. And if they see that the animal has been spayed or neutered, then functionally that animal is dead, right?
Yeah,
that animal,
from
a biological, zoological perspective, has no fitness if it cannot reproduce or has not reproduced. And so you can reach situations. I mean, I don't want to get into I'm not the expert on the controversies around the long-term health impacts of spaying and neutering, but certainly you can have experts, equally expert, but trained in different disciplines, and their definition of animal welfare can at points be completely opposing. And that then forces you to be at least a little bit anthropological and try and take a step back and say, well, is there such a thing as context independent definitions of welfare? Is it possible to form a compromise?
So it reminds me of a study that somebody did, and they basically, and I wanted to do a variant of it. So this is where I'm going to get the false memory. There was definitely there was a study done with bicycles and backgrounds and people evaluating it. And I did something similar with students where I tried to basically Photoshop a horse, and I had it in, and I put it in a stable, and then I put it in a muddy field, and I asked people to evaluate its well-being on the, and the horse is looking exactly the same, but it's just in completely different environments. And most people say, oh, the horse is in the lovely warm stable and it's, protected. And, there are few things worse for a horse than being boxed up and restricted, because if there's anything it scares it, it can't run away, etc.
Right.
And, so much, and I think it's a really good point, so much of animal welfare is contextual.
Right.
I was at a conference. Well, it was a real conference with real people,
Oh, wow.
That's so exciting. It wasn't last year, I can tell you that. It was the year before last in Japan. I was invited to the International Environmental Enrichment Conference in Japan, and I spoke about horses, and I met up with Rob Young, who's one of my former colleagues, who's now at Salford. And he gave a really, I'm trying to think, did he give the talk, or were we just chatting in the bar afterwards? That's why I can't tell the difference. But anyway, he was sort of saying, it's all about the life you lead. It's not about how you are at the moment. And that's the way that we've got to start thinking about welfare. It's not, well, I do this and that's terrible. I mean, there are things obviously that should be unacceptable, but we're all going to have good and bad. In fact, I was doing a podcast earlier this week with Sarah Heath, and we ended up chatting about the same thing. We all have our highs and lows. For those, we are recording this on for me, a Friday afternoon after a fairly tough week for me. And I'm feeling so much better already, Clive. So thank you. It's sort of, I guess it's midday for you. And that's why I'm hitting the wine and you're hitting the water.
Coffee, I've finished it now.
Okay. So maybe you can start hitting the drinks now. But I remember him saying, it was in his talk, because he said he drew the analogy from the movie with the Last Samurai with Tom Cruise.
Okay, I haven't seen it.
Well, okay, it's about this guy and whatever, and he has to deliver the fact that his son has been killed, and his father says sort of, well, how was my son killed? All about the honor system. And Rob sort of tells the story, and he sort of says, well. And Tom Cruise says, I will not tell you how your son died. I will tell you how he lived. And it's such a brilliant line in the movie. It's a Tom Cruise movie. It's well worth watching. It's Friday night. Just to pass away. I've got to watch the tobacco movie, by the way, and we'll talk about that.
Oh, that is very good. Yeah. So your story with Tom Cruise reminds me of my visit to the Bahamas, which I think I talk about in the book. I'm now not quite sure whether I do or not, in Dog Is Love. So I went and I visited.
Going everywhere in the world. I want to know how you've managed to travel everywhere, by the way. That's
wow.
Great.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So
I visited the Bahamas just for a couple of days, and there is, or was, I think he's retired now, a professor of sociology at the College of the Bahamas, William Fielding, actually an Englishman like us. And he's a social scientist. So he doesn't direct. So in the Bahamas, you have street dogs.
Yeah, now, you do mention them. Yeah.
So there are street dogs all over the streets of Nassau in the Bahamas. It's not a third world country, but the people have a cultural attitude that they actually value having the dogs free to roam. And he gives the same questionnaire to the local people, the local Bahamians, and to visitors on cruise ships who are primarily middle-class Americans. And it's very, very interesting, because you ask the American visitors, what's the right thing to do with your dog while you're out at work during the day? And they say, and they're not wrong, that your dog must be locked up safely in your house, because that's where your dog is safe and won't come to any harm. And that's an accurate sentiment. That's accurate, right? That's correct.
Yeah.
You ask the local Bahamians, and they say, when you go out to work and to see your friends, you have to let your dog out, because your dog is a social being like you are, and he needs to go to work and he needs to see his friends. It would be cruel to lock your dog up in the house all alone where he has nobody to talk to. And that is also an accurate sentiment. Both of these completely opposing sentiments are completely true. They're just different definitions of welfare.
Yeah. So when I first qualified, I worked for the PDSA in Plymouth, and there was I had a little house, a little terraced house, a block of 4 houses, and 2 doors down were a couple who worked as nurses, and they had a dog, and they were from Liverpool. And every morning when they went to work, they'd turn the dog out on the street.
Yeah.
Because in Liverpool, you know, there's a cultural thing, and you don't see it now. I'd be interested to know. I'll have to ask some of my friends in Liverpool whether it still goes on. But in culture, you know, it was cruel to leave the dog shut up. And, you know, when they got home, the dog was sitting at their door waiting to come in. Now, the dog had a risk of being run over and things like that. But it's, as you say, it's such a fascinating issue, and trying to understand people's perspectives rather than just fighting your corner, which is what goes on in Facebook world and social media. You know, you disagree with me, I'm unfriending you. I don't want to hear from you. I want to hear from the people that disagree with me. As you know, just last week, you know, I got this thing coming through about a paper that we'd published where the sort of shock collar people really don't like it, and they're just picking holes in it, and you know, and I decided, right, okay, I'm going to post that on my Facebook site. I'm not afraid to take criticism. I'll tell you actually the interesting thing. Just yesterday, the only thing that I know that has come out of that is, you know, I've had lots of letters of and emails of support from people saying this is, you know, you don't understand why they're going after you. But I also had a message from an Italian saying, oh, that's a brilliant paper, can I translate it into Italian? So for people who don't know, we did some work, and it's field work. So, you know, and again, there is no such thing as the perfect experiment. And this actually, this will be quite interesting because, as you say, you know, as an experimental psychologist, you do a lot of very controlled experiments, but you've also moved into the field setting where it is a different world. So we looked at the response of dogs to training. We got a grant from the government, and we took the best trainers that the Electronic Collar Manufacturers Association could find who used e-collars. We had a group of dogs that were being referred to them, and they had to either train them with the e-collar, and they would say, well, you know, they didn't have to use just the e-collar or without the e-collar, because they said sometimes they don't use it. The dogs were randomly allocated, they trained them. And then we had a third group, which is a group of 2 trainers from the Association of Pet Dog Trainers who will not use shock collars, they'll only use rewards. Now, obviously, and in the second part with the APDT, we had to try and match the dogs as best we could. So we had to do the first study first. Now, there are environmental differences, absolutely. But I would say you know, and when you report in science, oh, there's this, that, and other, one of the problems, especially with welfare, is people pick the behavior, think, but it could mean this, or there's this one. And one of the things that I've got really interested in increasingly is humanities and humanities research, and exactly the sorts of things you're talking about. And one of the problems, and I'm hoping to get a paper out later this year about evidence-based medicine and the problems with evidence-based medicine, because it favors that physical reductionism, which as behaviorism did. And that is great for certain aspects of science. But when it comes to care, and when you look at evidence-based medicine in the human field, one of the criticisms is it creates these algorithms for clinicians to follow and takes away the art of medical care. And when you're dealing with a patient, you're dealing with an individual. And, you know, I had a similar experience with the youngest of my sons many years ago. Both our boys, when they were young, they had quite bad eczema. And Thomas, he would get this eczema, and it was clearly related to a deep infection of the skin. And just the steroid cream would not resolve it, because the steroid reduces the inflammation, but it makes the bacterial growth worse. And it was just before Easter. We went to the doctor and they said, right, okay, well, the protocol is that we, she taps into the computer, lovely GP. And she said, I'll give him the steroid cream. I said, that's not going to work. And she said, well, we have the nice guidelines. This is what we're supposed to follow. And I said, look, with all due respect, I'm a clinician myself. You've got to treat the individual, not, we've been here before. We're about to go into the Easter holiday. It's a Thursday. By Saturday, he will have, bleeding hands and whatever. And to her credit, she said, well, what would you like me to do? And I said, well, we know that this antibiotic tends to work. Could we have some of that? And she prescribed it, and he then went through fine. But this is the problem with just thinking about these things in physical terms. You can find what's most efficient for the population.
Right.
But, every animal is an individual. Every dog, as you say, loves you as an individual. And it's that emotional side. When we'll get to talk about the book, I'm loving it. Thank you, as I said. But it's that side of things that gets completely missed. And I think increasingly as certain scientific disciplines move into the behavioral field, they're again just thinking on the focus of population. So, we published a paper last year on separation-related problems in dogs, started to define them by groups because people were just thinking about them in terms of a very broadly defined population. And there's so much richness in the individuals, and it's understanding that aspect. And it's difficult to do research where you take account of it. And, in the human field, they've become much more aware of this, and they say, well, and you need the clinical judgment. Which is, medics and vets, we're told it's an art and science of veterinary medicine or just medicine. And we mustn't lose sight of that. I think it's so important because otherwise we just go for the obvious things and we don't offer the best healthcare and all welfare from that perspective. But anyway, that's my
there are two themes there to pick up. One is I want to resonate with you about the amazing diversity of the individuals within the species that we're interested in. So we talk about dogs, and at one level, people have an awareness that there are a couple of hundred different breeds of dog. What people tend to be under aware of is that there's as much behavioral variation within a breed as there is between breeds. So you have an immense amount of variation, which is based on certainly between breeds, very diverse genetic material, and then between individuals, very diverse personal experiences. I mean, I tell people, your dog, I don't make any claim to be a clinician, but nonetheless, I get a certain amount of email of people saying, my dog poops on the carpet, what should I do? To which I say, I'm not a clinician, I have no idea. The long answer is, why a particular individual does a specific action at a particular time under certain conditions is a consequence of its genetic material, plus or multiplied by every single life experience it's had since the instant of conception. So that, and in the book, I described going and visiting this guy here in Phoenix who'd had his dog cloned. And we went and we visited him, and he has the adult from whom the genetic material was taken. Her behavior is very different because she's like 15 years old. She's a really old lady dog. But then you've got the two offspring who are not only genetically identical down to the last, syllable of DNA, but they also were conceived in the same moment, in the same test tube, implanted in the same womb, born within instants of each other. And yet they come out and they've always lived together in the same household. And yet you meet them and they're chalk and cheese. And so people it's crucial to understand the diversity of individuals.
I always thought it was interesting because the first sort of companion animal that they cloned was a tortoiseshell cat, and the marking.
I thought it was the Dolly the sheep.
Oh no, companion animal. I said
companion
animal. Domestic. You're right. It was Dolly the sheep. But in tortoiseshells, the color markings are partly dependent on heat in the womb.
Oh,
so even though it was a genetically identical, it looked nothing like its clone. And it's like, that is so brilliant. I think sort of people are thinking, did somebody mix up the test tubes?
So that's one dimension that you picked up. But then you also started picking up this political dimension, which is very new to me because you know, when I worked with damn pigeons and even with marsupials, there were no groups in the community at large that had fixed ideas about what pigeons ought to be or what marsupials ought to be, and who therefore would attempt to push me or would invest money on one side or the other. This thing with the shock collars is new to me. And so that you mentioned that, and I received one of these letters as well. A number of us last week received letters from a lobbying group in London telling us to be more critical of your research. And I mean, that was weird. And I actually wrote to them and had a brief correspondence with them where I basically told them that what they thought they were doing would completely backfire, because you cannot tell, I mean, you cannot tell professors or academics or researchers what to think. And once it becomes known that there's an outside pressure group trying to push us in a certain direction, we're sure to want to push against that. And at least I can say that in the correspondence, they were respectful and quite intelligent. But they're not the only one. I've been aware for some time. For example, we have published a little bit of research on pit bulls, which, you know, they're a bête noire around the world and in the United States. And we did a study showing that actually when animal shelters label a dog as a pit bull, they're taking a crazy guess, and it's pretty unreliable. And so I had a group, they call themselves the National Canine Research Council, which makes it sound like it's some sort of governmental organization, but they're not at all. They're just a private, it really boils down to one very wealthy individual who has a great love for pit bulls. And they wanted to pay me to travel around the country giving talks about our finding. And they had very specific lines of research that they would have funded to demonstrate that pit bulls are good. But anything at all open-ended, any real science where the outcome is an open question, they would never touch anything like that.
Yeah, I've chatted to them a few times, and it was an interesting experience. So it's Bradley who, and she sort of worked closely with Ian Dunbar, and you know, she pointed out that more people die from drowning in a bucket than they do from dog bites in the US. So. And just to put things in perspective, but yeah, you get these lobby groups, and it's an interesting, it is a really interesting thing about, yeah, the it's probably always been there, but this was so overt, and I you know, and I think it's it's an interesting turn, and as you say, I think it actually has backfired on them from all I can tell, because as I said, you can critique work, and that's fine, but you know, we did the work with the Labradors and the Border Collies, and I don't know if you know this, the study that we did, but we looked at Labradors and Border Collies, and we looked at the working lines and the show and pet lines.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at certain behavioral traits in them, on average, here's your, we were focusing on different aspects of impulsivity. On average, your Border Collie is up here. Those of you listening to this, my hand is higher than, my left hand is higher than my right hand. You know, and your Labrador is down here. On average, but when you look at the spread in the population, it goes like this. You know, it's a complete overlap.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is when you look at the show lines where they've been bred, whether they're a Border Collie or Labrador, to stand there while somebody fills them all over and squeezes their testicles and all sorts, there's virtually no difference between the breeds. But if you go for just the working lines, there is a difference.
Right.
And, you know, and this is it, you know, so within a breed, there's enormous variation. And just because something is on average different doesn't mean, as I say, from a clinical point of view, that it doesn't matter that this condition is more common in Border Collies than Jack Russells if the dog in front of me in the clinic is a Jack Russell.
Yeah, right.
Or it's a Bichon Frise where it's never been reported. Well, then I might think, well, you know, why? So I was chatting actually somebody again. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and I've forgotten who it was, and they said, "Oh, it's a bit disappointing." And I said, "Data are never disappointing. They're just interesting."
Yeah,
It was one of my master students actually. You know, and I just think. So, you know, again, appreciating what happens on average. And I spoke with Pamela Reed, and again, she makes the distinction between the pit bulls bred for fighting, which go into the ring, versus pit bulls as a breed. And we would, when in the podcast there, she was saying sort of when I said something about pit bulls, you said, you mean fighting pit bulls. I thought, yes, thank you for correcting me, because it's so easy to slip into that. But I love that paper that you did, where you looked at changing you sort of you don't say what breed or mix it is, and then suddenly people think it's a lovely looking dog.
Right.
And we are so, we have this enormous confirmation bias. We so quickly latch onto something and then think, let's look for the evidence to support this. And we need to get people. In fact, a few days ago, well, couple of weeks ago, I published this thing, and I just on my Facebook page, and I just said, we really need to be teaching the philosophy of science to kids in primary school. It can start there, because it's all about understanding the world and what knowledge is. Kids are incredibly curious, and I just think that we've, unfortunately, with the national curriculum, and and it's not just in the UK, it's happening everywhere. People want to be able to compare schools, and there are bad schools and whatever. But by having such a restrictive curriculum, and you said you like your first degree in human sciences, you could just do anything. That's such a brilliant way. But by restricting people in what they study, they get focused on content rather than. My dad used to sort of well, don't confuse your education with what you're trained to do. And I just think education is about life, and going to university is about getting an education and also being trained in something. And this is the sad thing about COVID. So many kids are missing out on the educational aspect, even with the best will in the world. And, we've taken enormous steps to make sure that the academic content, but that social side, and I've got another son who's in his final year, that's completely stripped out. It's really hard. And it's where you sort of find yourself as an individual. But anyway, so let's move on, because we talked about human sciences. Then your PhD is in foraging in the Barbary dove, optimization, evolution, and rules of thumb. Now, to me, that sounds like a behavioral ecology PhD.
No. I can see, I haven't thought about it for a long time, but I can see how the title is somewhat misleading. So these were animals in Skinner boxes. And the only reason they weren't pigeons was because the psychology department happened to have a dove colony, which was a much easier access than getting any access to pigeons. So I took doves and I put them in a Skinner box, and they were working on concurrent schedules of reinforcement, which was something people were interested in the 70s and early 80s. But I was interested in my then naive way in doing what I was talking about, in trying to meld behaviorist and ethological approaches. And so I tried to do, and in retrospect, or after all these years, it seems naive to me now, but I tried to do a sort of ethological analysis of the behavior of animals in a Skinner box on a pretty standard kind of behaviorist sort of reinforcement schedule. And I won't try and claim that it was a great success, but that's what I was trying to do at the time. And that's why I gave the dissertation the title, which, yes, if you only see the title, it does sound like I was out there following these doves around doing some kind of behavioral ecology, but that wasn't what I was doing.
Okay, now I understand. So I've not read your thesis, so. And it just reminds me, there's a video that I show the students that's available on YouTube, and it's Skinner commenting on some pigeons pushing a ball from either end.
The tennis, sort of table tennis.
The table tennis. And I show it to the students because Skinner says something along the lines of, and as you can see, it's a real game because they're sort of pushing the ball and there's a winner and they get reinforced. And I say to the students, what do you make of this? And it's sort of interesting. I said, what do you make to the commentary? Can you spot anything? And they pick up and they say, well, he says it's a real game, but they're only doing it for a food reward. And a game you do for pleasure. You play. Yes. When you play because it's enjoyable, not because somebody's going to give you food. I'm not. I am drinking wine tonight, and I've had a tough week. But I'm not chatting to you because it gives me an excuse to drink wine. I'm chatting to you because I enjoy chatting to you. But it's interesting. When I saw that the first time, I thought, hang on, there's these behaviorists who talk about behavior and they make such gross descriptions of behavior, you know? And it's lovely to
Well,
hear that
so
actually, yeah, you actually tried to look at what the animals were doing, because you do see that actually in quite a bit of the behaviorism literature. Here they are talking about the observable, and they don't look in a lot of detail in some places to distinguish. They're very quick to categorize things as being similar, which you think,
well, the Skinnerian school is the most amazingly blind way of analyzing animal behavior you ever heard of, in that once the animal is settled and knows what to do, you close the box and the box is opaque and you do not see what is going on. And the behavior is recorded automatically. Either the rat presses a lever or the pigeon pecks a plastic key. And you don't measure the duration, the delay, the intensity. All you measure is the rate, how often that behavior happens, which is the most restricted analysis you could possibly.
And what does that tell you about the real world? It tells you what might affect behavior, but it bears no reality. And again, this is something which it took me a while to realize. And as I started to work with, as my colleagues remind me, real scientists as opposed to vets, that actually, animals live in really complicated worlds.
Yeah.
Just because it's been shown in a lab that could affect a dog's behavior, that doesn't mean that in your home, your dog gives two stuffs about that, because there's so many other things competing for its attention.
Yeah. But it is in itself, all science progresses by cutting down the complexity of the real world into portions that can be clearly analyzed. And so in and of itself, the attempt is not completely unreasonable. The degree to which it was driven is kind of extreme. But I think that the remarkable, obviously people have always known that rewards and punishments can influence behavior, but the degree to which that is true is surprising, I think. I think that does count as something of a discovery, the degree to which behavior can be driven by reward and punishment. And when you think about things we do for fun, ultimately fun is like pleasure is like an intermediary. And I notice this with my piano playing, right? So it's like pretty much the only hobby I have is that I play piano. And if I play piano every couple of days, I enjoy it.
I need you to make a little tune for my podcast. You can give me a little.
I'm very curiously. I'm not the least bit shy as a public speaker, but I'm painfully shy as a piano player. I cannot even. I have a real piano, a grand piano, but I also have an electronic keyboard. And if there's anybody else in the house, I'll play my electronic keyboard because I can't bear to think that people can hear me. Anyway, enough about my neuroses. If I play every couple of days so that my fingers maintain a certain fluency, it's enjoyable. But if I leave it for a week so that my fingers lose fluency, it ceases to be pleasurable because there's no good sounds coming out there. And I think, if you play a game, if you're consistently crap at it, am I allowed to say crap?
Yeah, you can say whatever you like. As long as I'm not going to say anything. I say a lot worse than that to the students.
Good. We would get into trouble saying that to our students. Anyway, if you're consistently poor at something, I think the pleasure usually wears off unless there's some, and interacting with each other is social reinforcement. So people study these kinds of things. There are these, the behavior analysts, they love doing this thing, right? That you tease a lecturer by having half of the class, one side of the lecture room, just stare glumly, and the other half look enthusiastic and smile and laugh if the lecturer makes any jokes. And you can observe how lecturers will move across the room, and by the end of the hour, they're talking entirely to the smiling, happy side of the classroom. So it's a powerful principle, and I don't blame them, overall, I don't blame them for having sort of stripped things down a bit to get at how that principle works. But it's clearly incomplete. Well, I was saying before we started recording that I'm extremely proud of myself. For the first time in 30 years, I'm reading a book in German, and I'm actually making sense of it. So I'm reading a biography of Konrad Lorenz, the famous co-founder of ethology, a more or less exact contemporary of Skinner. They both, Skinner died, I think, in 1990. and I think Lorenz died in 1989 or something. They lived through, you know, most of the 20th century. And reading about Lorenz, I'd actually sort of forgotten how in the second half of his career he became such a sort of well, you know, philosopher, he wrote about the human condition, you know, and the phrase that they quote, which apparently was used about Lorenz, in German, they say he went from ganz aufs Ganze, from the goose to everything, right? And it's interesting because Skinner did exactly the same. He went from the pigeon to everything. You know, he went for all those empirical works on pigeons hidden in boxes to books with titles like Beyond Freedom and Dignity, you know. And so it's very interesting to me that on opposite sides of the Atlantic and perceiving themselves as being in diametrical opposition to each other, they actually did something very similar. They took a limited set of observations on one species of animal under, okay, Lorenz was studying under more open outdoor conditions, a richer set of conditions, but still, you know, the behavior of the gray-lag goose is not everything you might possibly know or could want to know about human society, surely. And they both did the same kind of thing in the same kind of way, which strikes me now in 2021 as obscene hubris on both parts. And yet when they were doing this in the 1950s and 60s, the two, I mean, quite different cultures, a German-speaking culture recovering from the Second World War, utter destruction, great shame, the American culture recovering, well, not really having to recover from the Second World War. I mean, there were human losses, but there was no economic collapse. There was no damage to the infrastructure of the nation. Very different culture, and yet they responded in much the same time, in much the same very positive way to this, and to think that this field that we're in, which I see as goodness knows, I see this as valuable. I think what we're doing is worth something, but I'm not going to come out and publish a book on how, you know, my studies, your studies on dogs or cats or whatever are going to tell us how people and human societies should organize our lives so that we end up getting the Nobel Prize for this. It's really strange.
It's interesting, yeah, because as you say, Lorenz got the Nobel Prize for that. Skinner did not get a Nobel Prize, did he?
No,
which is interesting. But I just wonder if it's because it was born of the time that they thought they were uncovering, you know, the universal laws in biology in the same way as, you know, Newtonian gravity and whatever. Just I've actually got about behaviorism up there, but have you ever read Walden 2?
Oh, I you know, so I really am going to be excommunicated from my behavior analyst friends now, because I read that and I couldn't believe that could have any resonance with anyone. I thought it was so naive. And I still have in my mind a very specific incident, which is that in the evening, they get together and they play Schubert's quintet. And what I find so fascinating about that is that I love Schubert's quintet with an unbelievable passion. I think it's one of the most beautiful products of the human imagination. And yet I'm acutely aware that I'm in a tiny, 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 tiny minority of humankind. And that if I actually lived in a commune and wanted to play Schubert's quintet with some people, A, I would never find 4 other people to play with me. B, even if I could, the kids next door would set up with some loud rock and roll or God knows what, and we wouldn't be able to hear ourselves play. Yeah. And it never crosses Skinner's mind that there could be these kinds of conflicts.
Well, this is it, the individual variability. So again, people who don't know Walden 2, Walden 2 was a novel written by Skinner, and it's fascinating. And what I find particularly fascinating about it is it was written in 1948, the same year as George Orwell, 1984.
Yeah.
And they are just such completely different views of the world. Yeah. Unfortunately, Orwell was closer to it. I'm afraid to say where we are now.
Orwell was a much better writer.
Yeah.
That's one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, Skinner can't really write his way out of a paper bag.
I'm not sure you'd want to write your way out of a paper bag, but give him his credit. So yeah, and I think that's the thing, you know, and in your biog that you sent me, you actually say my approach is behaviorist in my emphasis on parsimonious explanations cognitive in my interest in rich behaviors, and ethological in my concern to see behavior as a tool in animals' adaptation to their environments. Do you realize just how unique that makes you, actually? I think that does make you quite exceptional. That
I don't
diversity.
know.
I love that. I've sort of, the reason why I'm looking is because I've got two screens and I've got one up there, and I highlighted that, and I just thought that is such a smart thing to say. I think I'm gonna nick it and adapt it.
Yeah,
for
well,
mine.
you know, it's an open access sentiment. You're welcome to.
It's such a nice way of expressing it, and that's what you do. You have, you're looking for that simpler explanation, but open to the variability. So actually, I'm just wondering, perhaps I ought to say at this point, we've probably been chatting about an hour, and if I can remember, I'm going to ask Thomas to break this into two parts, simply because I just wonder, because an hour is a long time for people to listen, and 2 hours is even longer. And I just think people ought to listen to this, because what we're going to do in the next part then is, perhaps I want to ask you about dog is love, etc., and much more. I've really enjoyed obviously what we've chatted about, but it's sort of a nice point at which to move on, because I want to ask you this really big question. So I'm going to just sort of pause.
Yes, can we have a pause?
You want to have a real pause? I actually want
Yes.
to do video, so we'll actually hit the stop recording buttons, and then we'll start again for part two. And join us for part two, when we're going to talk about dog is love. We're going to really talk about the dog side of things. But if you're listening only to part two, you've missed a great part in part one. Okay.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay, cheers.